Early acquaintance with Mrs. Piper, 1885. It was during the winter of 1884 to 1885 that I became acquainted with Mrs. Lenora A. Piper, the famous psychic, who, for so many years, has been generously contributing of her time and her special gifts to the cause of spiritual science under the auspices of the English Society for Psychical Research. I was invited one evening, with a personal friend, to a family gathering of about a dozen people because of my newly awakened interest in phenomena called psychical. Mr. Piper Sr. was present, as were also Mrs. Piper and her husband. The personality of Mrs. Piper, then a young woman with her sweet, pure, refined, and gentle countenance, attracted me at once. The company sat around a large table, and I think there were one or two sensitives present who made some little exhibition of their powers. But nothing occurred that made any impression upon me, or that remained in my memory, outside of what was connected with Mrs. Piper. During the course of the evening, she retired with one or two of her friends to a small room adjoining and opening into the large room in which the company was assembled, and, as I understood, when under control, whatever that might mean, it was something new and strange to me. I think she had not then begun to give sittings outside of the immediate circle of her own family, but was in the process of developing her powers. Her husband explained to me that she was a little bashful about going into trance, under the eyes of other people, and, for that reason, had retired to the smaller room. I heard the sound as of someone talking in a low tone, issuing from the small room, and, as I remember, Mr. Piper told me that the poet Longfellow was supposed to be speaking through his wife, and a little later in the evening, that Dr. Finuit had arrived. Dr. Finuit was the name assumed by the early spirit control of Mrs. Piper. He claimed to have been a French physician who passed out of the body, somewhere in the vicinity of 25 years previous to his returning through the organism of Mrs. Piper. While under the control of Finuit, Mrs. Piper rose and walked out into the large room, and the control addressed a few remarks to the company in general. I chanced to be standing near Mrs. Piper, with the lady who was my companion that evening, and Dr. Finuit, Mrs. P., put his hand on my shoulder and said, in his emphatic way addressing us both, "You are very harmonious." This was my introduction to Dr. Finuit, dear old Finuit of those early days. For it proved, in course of time, that in spite of any and all idiosyncrasies and crudities which this personality displayed, he succeeded in endearing himself to all those with whom he had numerous conversations, probably without exception. Some of whom speak of him to this day, with familiar affection. I lost no time in making an appointment for a private interview with Mrs. Piper to take place as soon as she might be ready to see me, and my notebook gives April 1885 as the date of my first sitting. This antedates by some months Professor William James's acquaintance with her, and he is the person who introduced her, in May 1887, to the man who became the first American secretary of the English Society for Psychical Research. Up to the time when Professor James made her acquaintance, in the autumn of 1885, she was not known as a psychic, nor even as a person who gave promise of developing psychic gifts. Except to a small number of friends and acquaintances of her immediate family. The hour was to me one of extreme fascination. Was Dr. Finuit really a discarnate spirit, temporarily and partially incarnated in this woman's body for the purpose of conversing with me? If so, how fortunate was I to be witness of so mysterious and interesting a phenomenon, interesting and significant wholly apart from what was said in the trance. For, let it be remembered that I am not presuming to discuss the nature of the trance from the standpoint of psychology. I realize that what is said, while the medium is entranced, is to the psychologist all important in his interpretation of the phenomena as such. I wish to record only observations and impressions, leaving theoretics to the scientist, to whom they properly belong. And while I may speak of my impressions as if they conveyed to me facts, I understand that the scientist must have something more than impressions before he can put before the world what he calls scientific truth. I found that Dr. Finuit understood me, and who does not flatter himself that he is not ordinarily understood? He seemed to know all about my good points, and somehow to have a special knowledge of my failings, and, from that time on, he sustained the relation of advisor and friend. I was altogether too proud to impart my secrets to even the closest living acquaintance, yet, confession being good for the soul, I found myself confessing freely to Finuit. But, although I may have appeared to those who knew me during this period foolishly eager to get advice from such a friend, or from any supposed spirit who professed to be able to give advice, I laid it down as a working principle, in the very earliest days of my investigations, not to follow the advice of any psychic which was contrary to the dictates of my own judgment. I do not consider that anyone who has not respect enough for his own judgment to consult it and to follow it in the conduct of his material affairs, even though it may conflict at times with what purports to be advice from spirit friends, is a fit person to carry on investigations into psychical phenomena. I did not have frequent sittings with Mrs. Piper, but I had a number each year under the Finuit regime, during a period of 10 years, which extended to September 1895, with the exception of one season when Mrs. Piper was abroad. Then there was a break of several years, for various reasons, Mrs. Piper not being able to give sittings all of this time on account of ill health. And in December 1899, I had my first sitting under the latter-day regime, an account of which will be given later. My first sitting, in April 1885, took place about 3 months after the death of a friend, whose acquaintance I had made when living in Philadelphia, by name Hiram Hart. In old reports, he is called H. Dr. Finuit advised me to wait about 8 months longer, saying that, by that time, I should probably hear from this friend. I waited that length of time, and I did hear from him, as it seemed, and I witnessed the interesting phenomenon of the gradual development of a new control. For, in the course of a little time, Hiram Hart succeeded in controlling the organism, almost as well as did Finuit himself. And during all this period of 10 years, he was my special communicator, though never, of course, occupying more than a portion of the time at any one sitting. The Finuit regime is ancient history now, in the Piper case, and I will not dwell on it here at length. A general account of these early sittings of mine was given to the SPR, and is included in an article entitled Observations of Certain Phenomena of Trance. But Hiram Hart has shown the persistent fidelity of a returning spirit, and has been, so to speak, a friend at court on the other side, keeping himself modestly in the background in these latter years. Because there has not been time for me to hold much communication with him, but appearing for brief moments, whenever he could serve my interests in any way, in my other relations, or sending to me a message of remembrance. It has been my habit, from the very beginning, to make notes of sittings very soon after they occurred, unless I had taken full notes during the hour, which has been my invariable custom of late years. And I have notes preserved, either in shorthand or transcriptions, of nearly every sitting that I ever had with Mrs. Piper, or any other psychic. Mrs. Piper builded better than she knew, when she elected to reside at Arlington Heights. The place is one of the loveliest of Boston's lovely suburbs. For the dweller in the city, like myself, it was most restful to take a train in the morning, at an hour when the tide of humanity sets toward the city, thus leaving the suburbs quiet. To ascend to the top of the heights, through an avenue shaded its entire length by beautiful trees. To meet Mrs. Piper's serene face, to mount still higher to an upper chamber, lock the door, watch the psychic, while she seems to lose all consciousness of my presence, and then be free to commune with whom. Richard Hodgson and Psychical Research, 1888. I find in my notebook a memorandum to the effect that, It was on February 10, 1888, that I first met Richard Hodgson at the rooms of the SPR at 5 Boylston Place, Boston. He had come from England early the preceding year and established himself in the city, acting first as secretary of the Old American Psychical Research Society, which in 1890 became the American branch of the English Society, which latter organization he represented for the next 15 years. I believe he was then looking up and interviewing Mrs. Piper's early sitters, and I had a note of introduction to him from Mrs. Piper herself, but found her at the rooms when I called and was introduced in person by her. From that time on, during the years, I saw him occasionally, not frequently. I communicated with him oftener than I saw him. I at first offered service to the society, in the line of reporting, and assisted Dr. Hodgson at times during the period of my acquaintance. Sometimes gratuitously, and sometimes being employed by him to make verbatim stenographic reports of sittings or copy of records already made. I learned his methods and became familiar with the technicalities of his system of keeping records of sittings, with notes thereon. Aside from the Piper work, I occasionally had sittings with other psychics, with whom he had not time to carry on investigations. For the purpose of enabling him to answer, more intelligently, the numerous inquiries that were made at the rooms of the society as to where to find professionals who could be recommended as having some psychical powers. I always took notes, and made more or less full reports to him of such sittings, which went on file with the SPR. I find that I reported a Piper sitting for him, which he could not attend, and which, I think, was one in a series of sittings carried on by some members of the American Society at that time in existence. As early as March 6, 1888, and in May and June of the same year, I attended a short series of sittings given by Mrs. Piper, for the express purpose of allowing Dr. Hodgson to find out what he could in his own way about the Finuit personality. We three met on successive Saturday evenings, Dr. Hodgson giving his time and his effort, I giving my report, and Mrs. Piper giving her services. This series was interrupted after the 5th sitting, but those 5 Saturday evenings were memorable, each one of 3 entering upon the undertaking in the happiest of moods, and each one standing by his or her part of the agreement. Dr. Hodgson asked questions and tried various harmless experiments, or what seemed to him at that time harmless, such as putting salt on the psychic's tongue when in trance, for the purpose or ascertaining whether Finuit was conscious of it in the trance, or whether Mrs. Piper was conscious of it on coming out of the trance. These experiments are not for me to discuss here. But I will say that about 12 years later, in 1900, in some correspondence with me regarding the transformations that had taken place in ourselves during those dozen years, Dr. Hodgson admitted that what he knew in 1888 about the care with which the person of the psychic should be guarded while in trance, and the conditions which should precede a sitting, was mere folly compared with the knowledge he had then gained by his experience. I remember the freshness of his enthusiasm of those early days, his intense eagerness to find out what is on the other side of the veil. He told me then that he would not allow himself to follow any profession or be engaged in any occupation for the mere sake of making money. That he would pursue only that kind of work in life in which his heart and his soul could be absorbed, with money if possible, without it if necessary. In all probability, the very first attempts at automatic writing by Mrs. Piper occurred in some of my sittings. The writing, there referred to as having occurred on May 23, 1891, was the first I had of any length. It was by the control Hiram Hart. Distinct messages were given, and I was asked to compare the writing with his own when in life. I did compare it, being convinced myself of the appearance in it of more than one old peculiarity, which I did not think, however, were sufficiently marked to be clear to others. Dr. Hodgson also made the comparison as an expert on handwriting, and would not admit that there was any similarity, worthy of mention, between the two styles except in the one capital letter H. This, he could not deny, was very much like the old style. I have only recently discovered a discussion, by Dr. Hodgson, of early attempts at writing, and a footnote which reads as follows.
Miss R., whose friend was apparently the first to write at all, using the hand while controlling the body generally, and also using the hand while Phinuit was controlling the voice, has shown me some of this early writing, and some writing of her friend when living. Some peculiarities were common to both, but not enough to found an argument upon, as to the identity of the communicator.
Previous to this date, December 8, 1888, Phinuit wrote my name and his name, and Hiram Hart wrote his own name. The two styles of writing were quite dissimilar. I have 3 words written by the Hart control, at a still earlier date, on July 2, 1888. All 3 of these instances antedate the occurrence of any writing, of which I have ever seen any account. These specimens are reproduced on the facing page, with the exception that I have given only one of the 3 words mentioned as coming on the very earliest date. It will be noticed that on December 8, 1888, a new way of spelling the Christian name Hiram occurs. There was more or less joking about this afterwards, between myself and the control Hart, the latter insisting upon it, that he really did know how to spell his own Christian name. I am sure that such inaccuracies as this, especially in early attempts at automatic writing, can now be easily explained by the experienced investigator, who is himself a psychologist. Or rather, I should say, that if they cannot be explained, since I believe the trance itself is not yet really explained, they form no hindrance to the acceptance of the theory, in a general way, that intelligences on the other side are endeavoring to communicate with intelligences on this side, through an intermediary, by the ordinary method of handwriting. In the winter of 1892 to 1893 came the extremely interesting series of sittings, arranged by Dr. Hodgson for the express purpose of obtaining further communications from that remarkable personality, George Pelham, who died in the preceding February and made himself known to some of his friends within a few weeks after his death. The history of the early GP communications, as they are called, is given in detail by Dr. Hodgson in the SPR Proceedings, February 1898, with which all students of psychical research are doubtless familiar. The sittings of this series took place in the evening, when I was able to attend as reporter. It is needless to say that all this work was most interesting and fascinating to me, and I considered myself specially favored in having opportunity to perform it. In September 1895, I had my last conversation with the personality known as Dr. Phinuit, though of course I did not know at the time that it was to be my last, or I should have felt that I was taking leave of a dear faithful friend. There was an interval of 4 years during which I had no sittings. Mrs. Piper was ill a portion of the time and was not giving sittings, and, when she did give them, I was not knowing to all that was going on in the affairs of the trance. I knew that it had taken on an entirely new phase, that the number of sitters had been reduced to a comparatively small one. I learned later that strange things had taken place, and that in the course of the year 1897, Dr. Phinuit was displaced by other controls, and a new regime was established. I presumed there was so much of greater importance, of which Dr. Hodgson had charge in the conduct of his work, that my small affairs had been lost sight of altogether. I feared I had had my last talk with my old friend Hiram Hart. In fact, I thought my connection with the Piper work had come to an end, whereas the truth is that by far the most important part of it was to come. It was in the fall of 1899 that I resigned my position in the police department, and, for a period of about 3 months, I enjoyed a rest from routine work. Hardly had I found myself at leisure, when Dr. Hodgson asked for my assistance to make copy of a volume of records of communications, which had been received in the course of the 2 preceding seasons, and after the important change in the mediumship had taken place. Much of this matter proved to be most fascinating reading, and the volume had, for me, an absorbing interest. For a few brief weeks, just at this time, I was living absolutely alone in a good-sized apartment, the friend with whom I shared the apartment being absent temporarily. If a diary kept during these weeks had recorded that I rose betimes, breakfasted, copied, lunched, copied, supped, copied, retired, it would not have been far from the truth. And I went to my bed singing, and slept the sleep of a child. While one world was entirely in accordance with my wish, shut out by the brick walls of my own apartment, I myself was being introduced to a new and different world. There were in these records descriptions of life on the other side of the veil, supposed to be given by one or more persons whose names are well known to English-speaking people, which were most entertaining. But of these matters I am not privileged, nor do I wish to speak in detail here. They are private records now in the possession of the English SPR, the publication of which lies in the discretion of the council of that body. Suffice it to say that I could not lay the volume down for more than a moment at a time, but kept it in my hand from morning till night. While this work was going on, or when nearly finished, I was surprised one day to receive a note from Dr. Hodgson saying that I might have a sitting. I went to the Heights on December 20, 1899, Dr. Hodgson accompanying me. I was practically introduced, on that day, to the group of personalities, on the other side, who have been, as it appears, managing the communications from that side ever since, among whom Imperator is supposed to be the leader, Rector the amanuensis and interpreter, who controls and looks after the organism generally, while the psychic is entranced. Prudence, Grosson, and the doctor members, all evidently assumed appellations. To which group, George Pelham, F.W.H. Myers, and one or two others, whose names are prominent, have from time to time been added. To say nothing of numerous lesser lights, friends and relatives of individual sitters, whom they have been and still are trying to reach. The reader who is not familiar with these matters is referred to past regular publications of the English SPR. Also to a book called Spirit Teachings, published by William Stainton Moses, under the pseudonym of M.A. Hodgson, London, 1883. A remarkable book, which is full of the spiritual teachings of the trans-personality calling itself Imperator. At this first sitting under the new regime, behold my old friend Hiram Hart appeared once more. Dr. Hodgson left the room temporarily, while I conversed with my friend. He had neither progressed out of remembrance of me, it seems, nor had he been unfaithful to early ties, but the moment there was opportunity, he was on hand. He asked if I knew that he had been calling for me for a long time, but in reply to my question, said he had been told why I could not come. The method of communication on this occasion was by writing. My friend made some of his peculiar H, and when I said, "Hodgson doesn't believe in those H's, does he?" he replied, "I do not know, or care. I know I am I. And that is, I am Hiram Hart." There were statements made to me at this, and a second sitting occurring a few weeks later, which proved, in the light of subsequent events, to be so important that they mark an epoch in my life. But these I shall have to reserve for a further chapter.